the granddaddy of our markets in the sense that it really captures all three variables that we are hoping politicians and other decision makers are thinking about as they make changes to things in the economy. So I want to bring us back to the three goals. Three goals. What do we got for three goals of the economy? Increasing real GDP, which is economic growth. Why, and let me pause on that one for a second. What's the intuition behind that? Why do we want more GDP? Why do we want, what would be the reason that more GDP, more the value, dollar value of all final goods and services, why would more of that be good? Because somebody might say, well, that's the problem with capitalism and the market economy. We're always focusing in on final goods and services, and that's what's wrong with this doggone country. What is GDP? Why do we think that that should be increasing? What does it reflect?
Economic growth.
It reflects economic growth, and what does that mean in terms of something that would be maybe meaningful to somebody you were having a conversation with that said, that's what's wrong with this country and capitalism is too much focus on GDP. What's your response back to them of why that is, I think, a reasonable thing to be looking at anyway? It's not everything, of course. What is GDP? It's what you're producing. Measure the standard of living. In what respect? Yes, I agree. I like that you brought in standard of living because that might start to impact people's thinking. But then again, at the Thanksgiving dinner or Easter dinner with your family, and they don't know what standard of living doesn't really have a lot of meaning to them. So how might you expand on that again? Their income. It's just really as simple as that, right? That means more income, and he's like, oh, well, I'm evil with my income, and I don't want more of that, right? Or you start to kind of say, oh, okay, gross domestic product is a measure of the nation's income, and if we have more income, the money itself isn't evil, but maybe what people do with it could be. The money's kind of amoral. Money doesn't matter if it's if you've got, to use Dave Ramsey's example, if you've got a brick doesn't have morals, right? That brick can be used to build a home for the homeless. Or holy, right? So money doesn't matter. So having more income isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it probably gives us more opportunities to do good things. But that really comes down to the people who have it, which might be a different story. So hopefully you can start to have in your arsenal that increasing real GDP. Why do I say real instead of just saying nominal or just GDP in general? Why the emphasis on real GDP? Kayla, you chomping at the bit? It's after inflation, right? So real equates to quantity of stuff. More food to eat, more cars to drive, more stuff to have that gives us happiness, not just more dollars or higher priced items, but actual quantities of stuff. That's what the standard of living is all about, is how much actual stuff we have. So all of that reflects our real income and factors out that inflation factor. All right, number 2. Low, I heard somebody say it, I think. Unemployment. So low unemployment. We want people working in general that want to work. we've acknowledged that there's going to be frictional and structural unemployment. That would be natural. So we're not trying to drive it to zero, but we want it to be operating probably around its natural rate or what a healthy growing economy would be operating at. So in general, low unemployment. And then finally, if you don't have these down in your notes or off the top of your head, you should be scribbling them down, because I want these to be imprinted as you're reading material, as you're going through.
Stable/low inflation.
Low and stable inflation. Good. So I'd like to start us getting to say these all as a class in chorus together. When I say, what's number 3? Low and stable inflation. Low and stable inflation. Keep things more stable. All right, so those are our 3 competing goals. The reason they are important is that we're going to use our tool of the goods market to see how we're doing on these things as we look at different policies or we look at how the economy is doing. Okay, so here's the goods market. Home base, where we'll start off many times. We won't start off there every time, by the way. But a lot of times we'll start off in what we call a long run equilibrium. And that is where all 3 lines intersect. So I'm going to kind of continue on with our example. We kind of ran out of time last time, but I kind of brought you verbally through the whole gyration, but I want to take a little more time getting you through it this time to make sure it's down, and I'm going to put some extra notes along with it. So in long-run equilibrium, the economy is operating at its potential level of real GDP. So this is the long-run potential level. It's humming right along nicely. In terms of unemployment, what are we at? Full employment, right. So we called this, I put in your notes last time, the full employment level of real GDP, i.e. the unemployment level is at its natural rate. So unemployment's 5%, 5.5%. Again, there's some debate on what that magic number is, but we're at the full employment level. Resources are fully employed. We're humming right along, cranking out final goods and services to the tune of this number. And the price level really kind of is what it is. And I like to a lot of times start this off at 100 just to keep the numbers easy. But the prices are at whatever they're at. All right, so again, this goes a long ways to just memorize, point blank memorize. Hopefully you'll understand more than this, but if you can at least write this down, then that might get you some partial credit on a test or problem. So we introduced the government wanting to have a policy of killing ISIS last time. And in order to do so, they're going to buy some nice weaponry for it. Might include some drones, some bombs, some bullets, maybe some new guns, all kinds of fun stuff, right? So we're going to have weapons of mass destruction of some sort or minimal destruction, but we're going to have to spend some money in order to weed out those ISIS people out there in the world. So what happens? If there's an increase in government spending, we characterized aggregate demand as it having a current level of spending as it goes. So one way we thought about it is aggregate demand is like our C plus I plus G plus X. I'm trying to leave off the pluses. This is kind of a different way. I kind of did it last time, but I want you to think about the economy is currently at some state. That state has a current tax rate, where we talked about consumption last time with the shifters. That state of the economy has a current level of investment at the current level of interest rates and profit expectations. That economy has a certain level of government spending that's going on. that economy has a certain level of purchases from foreigners, higher government spending due to ISIS. And so once we've got our shifters memorized, this becomes a little bit easier. That if the government spends more money, then that's going to increase aggregate demand. There's going to be more spending, a higher level of spending done by the government. Now bear in mind, we're not necessarily raising taxes to pay for that spending. We might be, but that's not what the problem says. So don't start thinking to yourself, oh, now that they're buying all these things to kill ISIS, they're going to have to raise taxes. And so that's going to reduce consumption and then it's going to shift back. Don't do that to yourself. Don't get shift happy is what I call it. Don't start telling stories that aren't there. In general, the little secret that I might give you, a little tip, is that usually when you read a problem like that, there's one event and that'll typically lead to one thing shifting, for the most part. We learned in the foreign exchange market that there was actually shifting two things with it. So there's some exceptions to the rule, but that's kind of a good thing to be mindful of so that you don't get shift happy. All right, so government spending goes up and aggregate demand shifts to the right. So let's go AD2. Here's AD1. Last time the notation I gave you, I said suppose that government spending, what did I say? Was it 100 maybe or something? 100, 150, 150, and then it bumped up to 200, right? So just to give you the feel of something changed and it increased. So this time I'll just kind of leave it here. I guess another way I could put this as G1, and then if I go C plus I plus G2X, these all stayed the same, C, I, and X, but G changed. And that caused the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. All right, so all of the things equal, what our model tells us is that the economy is going to drift up to point B. In the short run, because that's the short run aggregate supply curve. So that's the first piece of detail that I'd like to add compared to what we did last time to make sure we got something good to review in your notes, is that the current state of the economy at any given point in time is shown by the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. So key point. The current state of the economy is always shown by the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So when we were at point A, that was the current state of the economy, right? The current state of the economy, the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply was point A, which just so happened to also be where the intersection of the long-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. Those just happen to marry up with each other. Now, after the demand shock of from A to B, and now no longer do we have that going on. But the current state of the economy is at point B, which means prices have shot up to 103. The price level, the economy has bumped up to Y2. Here, with the long run aggregate supply curve, that shows the long run potential for the economy. Right now, the economy has heated up beyond its potential and opened up what we call an inflationary gap. An inflationary gap. Whenever the current level of real GDP is greater than potential, we say there's a gap. And gaps tend to get closed, is the idea of calling it a gap. So this is an inflationary gap, and it's going to ultimately close. Now, when I said prices went up by 3%, did all prices in the economy go up by 3%? No. Now there's a couple different ways to actually look at that. Who wants to take a stab? My question is, when I said prices went up by 3%, notice that I'm assuming you all know that inflation is equal to the percentage change in the price level, which is the new price level minus the old price level divided by the old price level. 103 minus 100 divided by 100 gives me an inflation rate of 3%. Did all prices go up by 3%? The answer is no. Why?
Things like gas, that level changes so rapidly.
Okay, so gas prices might have climbed by 10%, and Gatorade prices might have climbed by 1%, right? So there might have been a whole bunch of variation on prices, so it's not fair to really think that all prices climbed by 3%. But if this is the CPI that climbed from 100 to 103, if it's the CPI, what can you tell me about that? On average, 3%. And what type of goods if it's the CPI index? Household goods, household purchases. Remember the shopping cart that we did in chapter 5, I think it was, where the CPI, the consumer price index, has a basket of typical items that the household buys, and that's what that index number is based on. So those have gone up by 3%. Now that's not the only story. That's one example of prices that went up by 3%. Not everything did, but on average, prices went up by 3%. What else didn't go up according to the model? According to this model, this is the spot where, well, let's look back in our notes. Flip, flip, flip. I want you to find this rather than me spoon feed it to you. According to this model, when prices climb to 100 to 103, that's not all prices. What prices didn't change? Super, duper, duper, pooper, important point with understanding this material in this chapter. Probably the most important point. What price didn't change when the economy moved from point A to point B? Lydia? Resource prices. Awesome. All right. That's worth an extra credit point. Good job. So, resource prices remain fixed. Now, I chose my words carefully when I said that because by the model, the economic model says that if the government, because now we can start to kind of put on our prediction hat a little bit here, right? So economists get paid 6 figures because they're in the prediction business, right? We care about what's going to happen. So when government spending increases, we predict that the economy would move to here if resource prices were held fixed. at whatever level they are. Just for fun, I'm going to create my own little index here. I'm calling it the nominal wage because I think conceptually that's there, but you're absolutely right. In general, it's all resource prices, not just labor, but all resource prices. We talked about pizza last time with the ingredients that go into making the pizza. So all nominal resource prices are fixed. That's what allows the economy to expand beyond its potential, because resources are still cheap while prices on the shelves of the final goods that the companies are selling are going up. That's a good deal. They're making more money. They're making more profit. They can afford to produce more that way. Okay, so eventually, though, people say, hey, I'm not able to put as much stuff into my shopping cart, i.e. number, what was it, 13 we just went through with Betty's real wage, right? I'm not able to put as much in my shopping cart because at $10, the price level used to be $100, which means my $10 wage gave me $10 of real goods. My real wage was 10. But now that the price level's gone up to 1.03, with using our math, it's something less than 10. And that sucks. I can't put as much stuff in my shopping cart because my real wage has gone down, even though I'm still getting 10 bucks an hour. My real wage has fallen. So, what was the thing that we said would happen? We'd ask for a pay raise. And so on the flip side, if we're talking about all resource prices, the point would be that resource prices are going to start to adjust as well. Once we start to have higher output prices, there might be this lag time between output price and resource price adjustment. And so we need to start thinking, well, how big of a raise should I ask for? Should I ask for 3%? 3% might work for now, right? But again, using our economic model, we can maybe make a prediction of where the economy's headed in the long run. And in the long run, we can't operate beyond our potential. And so the long run, we'd expect the economy to gravitate to where the aggregate demand curve intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. Let's call it point C. So now we've got our prediction hat on again. And I want to put my next key point here to understanding this. In fact, let me put 2 key points here. First of all, it's always in there. Key number 2, resource prices are fixed along the short-run aggregate supply curve, which we restated last time too, so we're getting some repetition because that is like the most important part of getting this stuff. So key number 3 that helps us figure this little issue out is that the economy is headed in the long run to where the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve intersect. So key point number 3 is that the economy is always headed toward the intersection of aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. That is short of there being any new shocks that came into the system, right? So kind of holding all of the things constant, our ceteris paribus assumption, resource prices will adjust such that we'll end up at point C. This is really the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about of allowing the market system to correct itself. prices convey information. The pricing system, as we look at the matrix of prices in the world, that is like giving us consumers information about what society values and what they don't. Things that we don't value very much are cheap. Things that are highly valued are expensive relative to their quantities and supply. So the pricing system is always giving us that information. And those prices are going to adjust according to the circumstances at hand. And what happened here is that the government blew some money on weapons, which put upward pressure on output prices, which in the long run will ultimately be inflationary for resource prices as well. That's the long run prediction with the invisible hand. So the economy is always headed toward the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply with natural market forces and no other shocks. This is the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about. The invisible hand will be guiding prices up to a new place. All right, so we can kind of cheat a little bit to think about what price we need. If we had this and we're like, oh, how much of a pay raise should I ask for? That's going to be determined by how much or where the intersection of the new aggregate demand curve and the long-run aggregate supply. If the economy is headed here, then ultimately the short-run aggregate supply curve will head there too and come to a rest, if you will, at higher resource prices. I put 105 here last time, didn't I? So we'd predict maybe a total change of 5% after thinking the long run and short run consequences of spending money on killing ISIS. And we end up at 105, which means the proper wage to ask for would be $10.50, which is a 5% bump in pay. Now my shopping cart is restored to what it was at point A. I can put the exact same number of stuff into the All right, let me pause there for a sec. What can I clean up for you? What can I clear up? What's that? You will eventually, or on a micro level, you're just going to lose your job, right? Somebody else is going to get that raise. That's at the micro level. But the macro level, we'd eventually get to this new equilibrium point. How long of a time? I don't know. That's what we're going to have. We're going to look at a few more theories here on how long that time is. A guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes, who was kind of the inventor, if you will, of macroeconomics, the way we do it today, thought that in the long run, we're all dead. That's how long he thought the long run was. In the long run, we're all dead, so why should we wait it out? Other economists have come in with some theories that say, you know what, that's probably not that long of a time. Maybe it's something shorter for various reasons we'll get into. But that's the question of how long does it take the economy to go from A to B to C? Okay, so let me add a couple more things in. Any other questions or clarifications? All right, so I'm going to kind of summarize our path here from A to B to C according to the model. So, short run effect. Call the short run versus what we call the long run in terms of this model. And in the short run, number one, an increase in government spending led to an increase in aggregate demand. The increase in aggregate demand caused an increase in the price level and an increase in real GDP. These two things kind of taken together here. In other words, we moved from point A to point B. Looks like you're mostly on there, but okay. Just to be extra anal about this, I guess, notice that we went from 100 to 103. Price level of 100 went to a price level of 103 at point B. And then, of course, Y2. That's the short run effect. The long run effect, the long run response to that is that resource prices are going to adjust. So the long run effect, number 3, I'm going to continue on the numbering here. So we got 1, 2, short run, 3. The long run effect is that there'll be a decrease in the short run aggregate supply to restore purchasing power of the nominal wage. And then I'll put parentheses, resource prices in general. So there'll be a shift to the left. And we'll end up at point C, a new long-run equilibrium at point C. And you might want to add, sometimes I do this a little differently, maybe my number 1. Kind of before this started, we started in a long-run equilibrium, which is what the problem gave us, remember, right? And then we shocked it with buying weapons, and then we kind of traced it through. And so we start with a long-run equilibrium. Okay, so how long does it take? How long does it take to move from A to B to C? Probably the best answer would be, I don't know. I don't know. So, Keynesian theory. With Keynesian theory, we'd say that resource price adjustment is pretty sticky. It's not going to happen real fast, so that there's going to be longer lag times. So with Keynes, who, let me give you a little bit more here, John Maynard Keynes. He wrote a book called The General Theory. And this was actually his PhD dissertation. And so he kind of had some pretty big cojones to come out of graduate school and say, here's the general theory of how the world works. Right? The general theory. Oh, really? Who do you think you are? Well, turned out he was onto something anyway, and I think it's been a question mark ever since as to how much credibility went into that theory as things unfolded that we'll talk more about. But the general theory was published in about 1936. So what was the timing like for that book? What else was going on in the world? World War II, we were on the brink of. And what else did we come out of? The Great Depression. So part of Keynes' writing was in response to the Great Depression, where we're like, wow, we had this kind of market system, capitalism, yay, pro-business, and then the economy absolutely went into a disaster. Anybody remember what unemployment rates were running during the Great Depression? I think it was in our reading. What'd you think? Yeah, like 25%. Imagine that 1 out of every 4 people that wanted to work was not working, right? That's huge. Right now we're just got back under around 6. We've been trying to get, just under 7 is where I think we're currently trending at. 25%, bad news. And so one of the things that Keynes brought to the table was to say maybe the government could play a bigger role in influencing the economy. Maybe the government could increase spending or decrease spending and maybe help to stabilize or fix, if you will, some of the economy.
Isn't that what we're trying to get away from? Is the government running everything?
Yes. I would probably vote for that, but not everybody, no. Yeah, so that's what's kind of come to. So the birth of big governments started with the Great Depression. And people were hurt. 25% unemployment. People were hungry. People were harmed. People saw other bad things, and they started to say, is there a better way? And we started to turn to the government to say maybe they can do something, right? And so the birth of big government really came in the Great Depression era. All right, so let me put that in here. General theory. Big government is born. And what I mean by that is Keynes promoted a theory that said we should use government intervention to help stabilize markets. So use government policy, which, remember, fiscal policy would be tax and G, government spending. We might also throw in monetary policy, but we mostly think of fiscal policy, but potentially monetary too. And so maybe we'd put money, use different types of government policy to stabilize markets. When we use the word market, we're thinking of voluntary exchange between individuals. Pretty much two people doing what they want, pursuing what they want to pursue, starting their own business, buying and selling stuff, right? Free from government intervention. So Adam Smith had the idea that, hey, we could get something good out of allowing people freedom, free to choose their own way, and that by people having that freedom, along with competition, will lead to the most prosperity. That'll lead to something good. That was kind of capitalism in a nutshell, or free market capitalism. And so we had this disastrous result, which, by the way, later certain theories pointed to the government making the Great Depression worse than it was. The standard story that you hear is that the market failed, and so now we need government to fix the market. But other economists have gone in and looked at maybe it was the government that caused it in the first place, or the lack of a proper infrastructure in the first place. So anyway, might point to the market being the culprit. So it's kind of a finger pointing game, and then there's different competing theories out there of who might be right. Okay, so that is kind of this Keynes argument here. Questions there? The free market people would be more of the classical economists. So classical theory certainly would have been led by Adam Smith. He was kind of the father of economics. In 1776, he wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations. And the arguments that the classical economists would say is that prices move pretty fluidly. So prices clear, so prices move freely to bring economy back to equilibrium. So our price mechanism, the free market, the invisible hand business, allows markets to clear and find the best path. Okay, as long as we're talking classical theory, let me throw in somebody we've already talked about. That theory would also be promoted by Uncle Milty. So Milton Friedman would fall more into this camp, this line of thinking. Somebody that we've spent some time with the quantity theory of money. All right, so let's do another problem here. Think about this a little bit more. So I'm going to draw the picture a little bit differently. We're not going to start with a long-run equilibrium. We're going to start a little differently. So suppose that the economy is currently looking like this. So you might want to watch me draw this before we go. So draw the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply to the left of long-run aggregate supply. So, economy doing good or bad here? In general. Good or bad? Bad, right? So, why do you say bad? It's not at potential. So going back to our key points, the current state of the economy is always shown by the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand right here. So your eyeball can start gravitating to that when you look at these pictures. And so the current state of the economy, let's just call it Y1, is less than our potential. So there's our starting place, if you will, with this particular problem. I'm not starting you in a long-run equilibrium. Where's the economy headed? I see a hand pointing up. Up means up and over. Okay, right here. That. Look back to key point number 3. Is that what I put in? Where's the economy headed toward? The intersection of aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. So just kind of remember, supply equals demand, right? One is the short-run situation, the current state of the economy. The other one is the long run, where we think we're headed. In the long run, we'd be heading down here, leaving market forces to themselves. The natural way the economy would correct itself is for resource prices to fall. And we would move to this point B. All right, so first of all, a little definitional thing here. We have what's called a recessionary gap. What was the other one called? Inflationary gap. So notice that the inflationary gap led to inflation, right? The inflationary gap led to higher and higher price levels. Here we've got output less than potential, thinking about that being like a recession. So we have a recessionary gap. Now technically, what is a recession as defined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics? Not 3, but you're on the right track. 6 months, which is 2-quarter decline in real GDP. So over time, the real GDP is falling for at least 2 consecutive quarters, which is 6 months. So don't put too much into the recessionary bit with this is a snapshot. A recessionary gap. So anytime the current level of real GDP is less than potential, we have a recessionary gap. All right. In order to get the gap closed, resource prices would need to fall. So we'd have resource prices starting to adjust this way, which might kind of hurt a little bit. There would be some deflation of the economy. Prices would start to fall. Now, Keynes had a different idea. What might Keynes have suggested in this situation? Government intervention. Of what type of sort might work to have government intervention to help stimulate the economy? Increase spending, right, which might have been jobs that they created or something, but more generally, increase spending. What else could government do to stimulate the economy? So buy some weapons to kill ISIS. We showed that last time. That's going to move this thing to the right and stimulate the economy. We'll get to the conclusions of that later, but
Would an increase in net exports?
okay, an increase in net exports, that would still, if it's government, because I'm thinking about a government policy, that would help us, but that would be more of a market response that would happen. So that'd be kind of a separate event. So Keynes's idea is to intentionally use government policy to pull us out of this recession. You're absolutely right. One of those things would be increased government spending. There's probably at least 3 other ones we could talk about. Increase G. Decrease taxes, right? So the tax rate, if we cut taxes, that raised people's disposable income, and that got them to spend more money at the cash register. So a decrease in taxes would also stimulate the economy. It would be an expansionary fiscal policy. And then what else we got here? What else could they do? We could increase government spending, decrease the tax rates, or, Sammy, you on your machine back there? Time to lose a point. Oh. So, Sammy, what could monetary policy do? So, if we're trying to stimulate the economy, would we want to increase the money supply or decrease it? Decrease it? Is that what you said? I just couldn't hear. Decrease the money supply? What do you guys think of that?
I think he said increase.
No, he said decrease, I think, right? Yeah. So what do you think of decrease?
Increase it. 'Cause if you increase the money supply, you increase Y.
Okay, you'll increase Y. Why? What's it channeling through? So if I increase the money supply, what happens? Why do they buy more stuff? What incentivizes them? Why do they have more money if it's just money? How do they get the money? What's channeling through the money market? Money supply, money demand, quantity of money, interest rates, increase the money supply, lowers interest rates. People buy a refrigerator, people buy a washer, people buy a car, people buy a house, people buy, as well as businesses buy. So that tends to stimulate the economy, an expansionary monetary policy. Okay, so we've got expansionary fiscal policy of decreasing taxes, expansionary fiscal policy of increasing government spending, or expansionary monetary policy of decreasing interest rates, increasing the money supply. All of those things tend to move aggregate demand to the right. Keynes thought that would be a good idea. Connor, how would they increase money supply? What are some ways the Federal Reserve can increase the money supply? Last question, I think, on your test today. Selling more bonds. Decreasing the reserve requirements and decreasing the discount rate. Right. So those 3 tools, discount rate, required reserve ratio, and open market operations, those are the tools in the toolbox of the Federal Reserve to do that. All right, so in general, Keynes thought, hey, let's do something like that. This will be the long-run adjustment in the economy eventually. In the long run, we're all dead. Let's go buy some weapons to kill ISIS tomorrow, and we'll have a much quicker response. And in the long run, we're going to get to here anyway, so let's just stimulate the economy through an expansionary policy of some sort and shift the economy out to AD2, which would bring us to B prime rather than B. So, economy moves to point B through natural forces. That'll be our reality, with invisible hand. This may be our reality with the visible hand of government intervention in the market. So this, through expansionary, fiscal, or monetary policy. Well, that sounds like a no-brainer, doesn't it? To go use government policy to get back. We're going to get back to potential one way or the other. What's wrong with speeding things up? Why can't we just speed up? We're going to get to B prime or B. This one's going to be long and painful. People unemployed, looking for a job. Eventually, the invisible hand will work itself out and we'll get to here. But otherwise, we can just jump in our Mercedes and drive that old economy right up to B prime in no time, and we'll be all set. Okay, Jeff.
If you're at the B, bought the invisible hand one, does that mean that your cost of resources is still at the short run?
No, so what would be happening at B, by the way, we didn't really draw it in, but let me just put a dashed line. I mean, this plays into the invisible hand part. Would be this. I didn't draw it in, but there would be a new short run aggregate supply curve.
It would move down.
Yeah, and that's the resource price adjustment. So the argument is that there's an imbalance in the pricing system, that resource prices haven't adjusted to reflect the whatever got us in the recession in the first place. And eventually prices will adjust back to this to bring us back to potential. Okay, so kind of a price imbalance, if you want to think of it that way, is why we're out at point, if we let things go to, or at point A, there's a price imbalance. And so Keynes thought, let's hit the accelerator and go up, otherwise we come down. What about our checklist? How are we doing on the checklist of things? Look at your 3 goals. How's our 3 goals checklist going? So we got 3 goals. Increasing real GDP, low unemployment, and low stable inflation. If we're a politician and we're doing check boxes here of should we go to B prime or should we go to B, how are we doing on our checklist? Number 1, good or bad? Good, right? So good, check. We're increasing real GDP from Y to YP. Low unemployment, or keeping unemployment low, is that good or bad under the situation of moving the economy here? Good? Why? What's the connection between this graph and unemployment? I don't see any unemployment there. Okay, more jobs. So there's a connection there with the production, if you will, the production of final goods and services. We need people to produce that stuff. So if we're producing more stuff, we've got more people employed and therefore less unemployment. So at the end of the day, check. That sounds good. Keynes, you're onto something. Woohoo! How are we doing with number 3? Not so good, right? So with number 3 is where we kind of fail. We get an F, if you will, on. So no check mark there because the price level has climbed to PL2. So now we start to see this trade-off business that policymakers are facing. It's like we want to get the economy looking better here, but it's at the expense of this. In other words, it's hard to have my cake and eat it too, right, through use of government policy, because if I do that government policy, I'm going to destabilize prices potentially, or cause inflation. Now, if it's a little bit of inflation, who gives a rip? If this is going from 100 to 101, who gives a rip? If this is 100 to 120, I give a rip. 20% inflation, right? So that's the story of where we're at on kind of playing these games, that what might work under one set of circumstances may not always work. Now, questions or comments there? All right, so let's do another one. Okay, so example. Suppose there is an oil price shock. OPEC countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC restricts the global supply of oil, and oil prices rise 40%. Starting with a long-run equilibrium, show the short run and long run effects of the oil shock. Okay, I'll walk around the room. Go ahead, go for it. You guys got all the tools. I've given you everything. This is the type of thing you'll face. I'll walk around and see how you're doing. That's all you get, right there. I'll come around and help you. You feel free to raise your hand. Did this grade sheet go around to everybody? Yeah. Everybody get this? Oh, and the sign in. Did everybody get signed in for attendance? Who needs this? Yeah. Okay, be brave. I see some of you have dug into home base. That's good. That's your first step. Get home base down. Make sure you label your axes. That's an important part of home base too.
Is there a reason that this was over here instead of right here?
Because I started. As I told you it. Yeah. I said, suppose that we start in a long-run equilibrium. Okay, what are you doing on this gizmo? Okay, good. So then make sure, that's what's a little tough with getting it small, but make sure you get the axes. And there's two things going on. Make sure you label your axes and then also put where the starting place is. Those are two important elements. Sometimes you guys remember one but forget to do the other. it's important for you guys to start it on your own. That's why I was looking for you guys to start. It'd be much better if I don't lead you along. Okay, so you got to think about that, what that oil price shock is going to do. So oil prices went up, and so what direction does the thing change? Think about the nominal resource prices. Those of you who are this far, what shifter is going to move? How is this change in oil prices going to impact the system? What do you guys do? Some aggregate demand? Is this yours?
Yeah.
Okay. So which one, why did you move aggregate demand? I mean, what was your shifter, I guess? Okay, so that wasn't given in the problem, so we don't know that for sure. So the government's going to spend more per barrel on oil if they're buying oil at all, but we don't actually know that, so don't read that into the problem. So what do oil prices, who do they impact? Are oil prices an input price or an output price? How many of you regularly shop for a 50-gallon barrel drum of crude oil, unrefined oil? How many people have bought one of those in the last year? Show of hands. Unrefined crude oil from Saudi Arabia. How many buyers we got out here? Okay, why aren't you guys buyers of that? Because you wouldn't know what to do with it, right? It doesn't add any value. Therefore, is crude oil an input price, a major input, or a major output? It's an input, right? So in the production process, oil is pretty important in the production of a lot of things in the United States. So nominal resource prices have gone up or down. Resource prices have gone up. And that trickles its way into a lot of different stuff. Semis use refined crude oil in the form of diesel gasoline. That means trucking costs went up substantially because eventually this is going to trickle into a lot of products, right? There's a lot of companies that use oil for a variety of things once it comes out of that crude oil form. So we have an increase in resource prices. On our list, what bell should that be ringing in terms of what shifts? Short run aggregate supply. This is a supply shock heading to the left or to the right? To the left, just like it did with our wages. When wages were $10 and they went to $10.50, we got oil now bumping up 40%. So we've got oil prices at the original short run aggregate supply curve being here, whatever the price of oil was. And now P oil 1. And now at the higher price, we've got a shift at P2 of oil. Higher oil prices. Okay, keep going. Now I spoon-fed you that. I want to see your graphs revised. The problem asks, what is the short-run effect and the long-run effect? What is the short-run effect and the long-run effect? Give me some points A's and B's and C's maybe in your paper. Would be kind of nice to see. Along with movements along your axes. So this is the one you got to get rid of. Because your B is just what I have drawn on the board. So if you erase that, we started at A. Oil prices went up, shifted the supply curve to the left, so we traced along here and moved to point B. So get an A and a B on your, hold on one sec. Where'd this come from?
Didn't that just shorten?
Nope. That is the short-run aggregate supply, but we didn't talk anything about aggregate demand. So I see quite a few of you shifting aggregate demand. Why are you doing that? I just want to mentally, because it feels good, okay, that's fine. I can live with that for now. I just don't want it to feel good on the test because losing points hurts. That becomes painful. But right now, I do kind of want to know what's going through your brain. It's okay. Talk to me. Why do you feel like you want to shift aggregate demand? Okay, now, so Todd says if we're short of it, there's going to be a shortage, we're going to start demanding more of it. That's not the way it works. So the only time we're going to shift aggregate demand is look to your aggregate demand shifters. Did some things change with the shifters? In fact, they're going to seek out, just to kind of get back to your thought process, if oil prices go up, do people ride bikes more? Yes, right? So oil prices trickle into gasoline, raises the cost of driving. Maybe I'll walk to work today or I'll bike, right? So we start maybe consuming less gasoline. So aggregate demand kind of stays put. Try to train yourself, because you're learning the economic model, train yourself that I don't move that aggregate demand curve unless, look at your shifter list. If one of these things change, then you move it. If it don't, it stays put. So, yeah, Kayla said that too. We don't know, don't tell yourself that story of the government spending money on oil. The government might not buy oil at all. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but you're reading more into the story that they're not, that whether oil is an important component of government spending, we just don't know that, so we can't assume that. And Jeff?
Well, I'm just going to ask, I mean, I'm not making the assumption, but if, given the scenario, if it causes consumers to spend less or invest less, so there's less consumption and less investment,
yeah,
couldn't that make this scenario even worse?
Right. And guess what? Your logic is great, and it's being reflected right here. Look what happened to real GDP. They spent less, right? Real GDP is C plus I plus G plus X. That went down compared to where we were before. If we move from point A to point B, we don't need to be shifting things to get results. The way the economic model works is that we move along from A to B and prices rise. The prices of the stuff that oil's important to, yes, those prices go up. Gasoline prices go up. It's right here though. An increase in prices and a decrease in output. We'll pick up there on Friday. Okay, well, Oxley didn't have the answer.
Okay.
So he's our tutor, but you needed to kind of verify some of that with him. But I mean, I hope he was close, don't get me wrong, but accounts for structural unemployment. Okay, let me see what you put.
I mean, I think it was a little different.
Yeah, let's look at what you have. Right somewhere. Here. Here, rather.
Do you have plenty of chapter 10 on YouTube?
Yes.
Because I'm going to miss Friday too.
Oh, you are? Okay. Yeah, there's lots on. Yep.